Late Thursday evening in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Albert Mason was standing at his kitchen sink washing dishes when he suddenly heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A desperate, guttural howling cutting through the roar of the storm. That piercing cry didn't resemble the bark of a neighborhood dog. It carried a raw terror, causing him to immediately drop the plate in his hands and rush to the window. Through the sheets of rain hammering against the glass, Albert could see water rushing down the street like a river, swirling violently toward the iron grate of the storm drain. The howling was coming from beneath the street. Albert threw open his front door and was instantly soaked. The wind whipped his yellow raincoat as he stumbled into the flooded street, the water already up to his shins. He dropped to his knees beside the storm drain, pressing his face close to the grate. In the darkness below, he could barely make out a small, thrashing shape, matted fur, desperate eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. The animal clawed frantically at the slippery concrete walls as the water rose higher and higher, already reaching its neck. Those wild, terrified amber eyes locked onto Albert's for just a moment, and in that instant, he knew he had only minutes before the creature drowned. At first, he thought it was just a frightened stray dog that had been swept into the drainage system by the flash flood. But this rescue was about to reveal something Albert and the world would never forget. If you're captivated by this incredible story of courage, compassion, and the wild secrets hidden in our own backyards, then you need to subscribe to Wildward Bound right now. We bring you the most astonishing animal rescues and wildlife encounters that will leave you breathless. Don't miss a single story. Hit that subscribe button, because if Albert's bravery moved you, imagine what's coming next. We share rescues you won't believe, twists you won't see coming, and connections between humans and animals that will restore your faith in humanity. Subscribe now and join our community of wildlife warriors, because stories like Albert's don't just deserve to be heard, they deserve to be celebrated. Click subscribe. You won't regret it. Albert stumbled back into his house, water streaming from his raincoat onto the hardwood floor he'd stopped caring about months ago. His heart hammered against his ribs as another howl pierced through the walls, longer this time, more desperate. He pressed his palms against his ears and squeezed his eyes shut. Not again. He couldn't do this again. The last time he tried to save something, he'd ended up burying his dog Murphy in the backyard under the old magnolia tree, and he'd sworn that was it. No more animals, no more caring, no more loss. But the howling didn't stop. It clawed at something deep in his chest, something he'd tried to bury along with Murphy. Albert's hands trembled as he lowered them from his ears. Through the window, lightning split the sky, illuminating the flooded street in stark white relief. The water was higher now, churning with debris, branches, trash cans, things he couldn't identify in the chaos. And beneath it all, that sound. That terrible, pleading sound that spoke a universal language of fear and suffering. He tried to turn away. He made it 3 steps toward the living room before his legs stopped moving. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened television screen, a tired man with hollow eyes who'd spent the last year and a half hiding from the world. Murphy would have been ashamed. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Murphy, who'd never ignored a soul in need, who'd once dragged Albert half a mile to check on an injured bird. The howl came again, weaker this time. Albert cursed under his breath and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the kitchen drawer. His hands were already shaking as he pushed back out into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall of ice. Within seconds, his jeans were plastered to his legs and his boots filled with water. The wind tried to shove him back toward his door, but Albert lowered his head and pushed forward, using the flashlight beam to cut through the darkness. The street had transformed into a raging creek, the current strong enough to knock him off balance. He steadied himself against a mailbox and swept the light across the rushing water until he found it. the old storm drain at the corner where Maple Street met his dead-end road. The grate was barely visible now, water swirling around it in a violent whirlpool. Albert waded closer, fighting against the current that pulled at his knees, then his thighs. The cold was shocking, stealing his breath. He dropped to his hands and knees in the flood, ignoring the sting of gravel cutting into his palms, and pressed his face close to the iron bars. The smell hit him first, wet fur, mud, and the metallic tang of fear. His flashlight beam found the creature immediately. It was small, maybe 15 pounds, pressed against the far wall of the drain chamber. The water inside was rising fast, already lapping at the animal's chest. Its head was thrown back, jaws open in another howl that Albert felt in his bones. But what stopped his heart was the water level. 3 inches, maybe 4. That's all the space that remained between the surface and the curved ceiling of the drain. The creature's eyes caught his light, wild, golden, filled with such primal terror that Albert's own fear evaporated in an instant. This wasn't about him anymore. This wasn't about Murphy or grief or the walls he'd built. This was about seconds and inches and a life that would end right here, right now, if he didn't move. "Hold on," Albert whispered, though he knew the animal couldn't understand. "Just hold on." He pushed himself upright and nearly fell as the current surged around him. His truck. He needed tools. Albert half ran, half swam back to his driveway, his garage light a beacon in the storm. His toolbox sat on the workbench where it always did, and he grabbed the longest crowbar with shaking hands. No time to think. No time to plan. The image of that rising water burned in his mind. The journey back to the drain felt like miles. The current had grown stronger, pulling debris past him. A lawn chair, a child's toy, branches thick as his arm. Albert dropped beside the grate and jammed the crowbar under its edge. The iron was old, rusted, and the centuries-old concrete held it like a vault. He threw his weight against the bar. Nothing. The metal dug into his palms even through his work gloves. He repositioned, braced his feet against the curb underwater, and pulled with everything he had. A grinding sound, a shift of maybe half an inch. Another howl from below, this one gurgling, interrupted by water. Albert's vision went red. He screamed into the storm and wrenched the crowbar with strength he didn't know he possessed. Something in his shoulder popped, sent fire down his arm, but the grate shifted. An inch, 2 inches. He adjusted his grip, ignoring the pain, and pried again. The grate suddenly broke free with a screech of protesting metal, flying backward and nearly taking Albert with it. He caught himself on the edge of the now-open drain shaft. Below him, the water swirled in a black vortex. The animal was barely visible now, just the top of its head above the surface, still fighting, still trying to survive. The opening was maybe 3 feet across, the walls slick with algae and decades of grime. Albert could hear the roar of more water coming through the pipe system, the main surge from the flash flood, racing through the underground tunnels like a freight train. He had seconds. Albert swung his legs into the opening. The water was shockingly cold, colder than the flooded street, and it immediately soaked through to his skin. He gasped as it reached his waist, then his chest. His boots found purchase on something, a maintenance ledge maybe, or accumulated debris. The current inside the drain pulled at him, trying to drag him deeper into the system. The concrete walls were slippery under his hands as he steadied himself. His flashlight now clamped between his teeth, casting crazy shadows in the confined space. The animal was 3 feet away, paddling frantically, its head barely above water. Up close, Albert could see it was exhausted, its movements growing sluggish. He reached out slowly, trying not to spook it, but his hand only met water. The creature was just out of reach, pressed against the curved far wall where the chamber met the main drainage pipe. "Come here, baby," Albert murmured around the flashlight. "Come on, let me help you." The animal's golden eyes fixed on him, and for a moment Albert saw the calculation there, the wild instinct trying to decide if this human was predator or salvation. Then the water rose another inch, covering its nose, and the decision was made. The creature tried to paddle toward him but was too weak, too tired. It slipped under the surface. Albert didn't think. He pushed off the ledge and plunged deeper into the drain, the water now up to his neck. His hands swept through the murky water. Feeling nothing but cold and current, his lungs burned. The roar in the pipes was getting louder. The main surge was almost here. His fingers brushed something soft. Fur. He grabbed blindly and felt his hand close around loose skin and bone, the scruff of the neck, the way you'd carry a puppy. He pulled. The animal came alive in his grip, thrashing with renewed panic, claws raking across his forearm. Albert held on, using his other hand to pull them both toward the opening above. His boots slipped on the algae. The current surged suddenly, slamming him against the concrete wall, and his flashlight fell from his mouth, plunging them into absolute darkness. The roar became deafening. Albert threw his free hand up and caught the edge of the street opening. With the last of his strength, with muscles screaming and his injured shoulder shrieking in protest, he hauled himself and the animal up and out of the drain shaft. They collapsed onto the flooded asphalt just as a massive wall of water exploded from the opening behind them, a geyser of muddy water and debris that would have killed them both. Albert lay on his back in the rain, the animal clutched against his chest, both of them coughing and gasping. The creature was shaking violently, its small body racked with shivers. But it was breathing. They were both breathing. Through the pounding rain and the thunder and his own ragged gasps, Albert started to laugh, a half-hysterical sound of relief and disbelief, and something very much like joy. He'd done it. Against every odd, against his own fear and grief, he'd actually done it. It wasn't until he struggled to his feet, cradling the exhausted animal against his chest, and started the stumbling journey back to his garage that a small detail began to register through his adrenaline-soaked brain. The weight was wrong. The feel of the body in his arms was wrong. And when lightning flashed again, illuminating them both, Albert caught a glimpse of a long, narrow snout and legs that seemed too long, too gangly for any dog he'd ever seen. But that was a problem for later. Right now, all that mattered was getting them both warm and dry. The questions could wait. The questions always waited. What Albert didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he pushed open his garage door and stepped into the fluorescent light, was that the creature shivering in his arms was about to change everything he thought he knew about his quiet corner of Louisiana and about himself. The fluorescent lights of the garage buzzed overhead, harsh and bright after the darkness of the storm. Albert kicked the door shut behind him, muffling the roar of rain to a distant drumming on the roof. The animal in his arms had gone limp, whether from exhaustion or shock he couldn't tell, but its rapid heartbeat pounded against his chest like a desperate drum. He could feel each shuddering breath, shallow and quick. Albert's workbench was cluttered with months of neglect, old paint cans, tools he'd meant to put away, receipts and mail he'd stopped caring about. He swept it all aside with his free arm, sending everything clattering to the concrete floor, and gently laid the creature down on the cleared surface. It didn't resist, didn't even lift its head. Just lay there trembling, its eyes half closed, muddy water pooling beneath its body. His emergency supplies were still in the cabinet where he'd kept them for Murphy. Old towels, blankets, a first aid kit he'd never had the heart to throw away. Albert grabbed an armful of heavy blankets, the ones Murphy used to sleep on, and began carefully wrapping the animal. The creature flinched at first contact, but was too weak to do more than twitch. As Albert worked, his hands moved with a gentleness he'd forgotten he possessed, tucking the edges of the blanket around the small body, trying to trap whatever warmth remained. The animal coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent a spike of fear through Albert's chest. Water trickled from its nose and mouth. He grabbed one of the towels and carefully tilted the creature's head, letting the water drain, then began gently rubbing its chest through the blanket. Another cough, more water, then finally a long, shaky breath that sounded almost normal. Albert pulled over his rolling stool and sat down, suddenly aware that his own body was shaking just as badly as his rescue. His shoulder throbbed where he'd wrenched it. His forearm burned where claws had raked across it, though he couldn't remember when that had happened. His clothes hung heavy with water and mud, creating a growing puddle around his feet, but he couldn't seem to make himself move. He just sat there, one hand resting on the blanketed form, feeling the rhythm of breathing gradually slow and steady. Minutes passed. The animal's shivering began to subside as the garage's warmth seeped in. Albert grabbed another towel and carefully began wiping away the mud caked on its head and face. That's when he got his first real look at what he'd saved. The fur, as the mud washed away, wasn't the solid black or brown he'd expected. It was a strange tawny color, reddish gold in the bright light with darker guard hairs mixed throughout. The ears weren't quite right either, too tall, too pointed, sitting stiff and alert even in exhaustion. And the snout. Albert paused, towel in hand, staring at the long, narrow muzzle. It was broader than a dog's, the proportions somehow off in a way he couldn't quite name. The animal's eyes opened fully for the first time since they'd entered the garage. Not brown like most dogs, not even the amber of some breeds. These were a bright, piercing yellow gold that seemed to look straight through him. And there was something in that gaze, something wild and aware and utterly foreign, that made the hair on the back of Albert's neck stand up. The creature shifted under the blanket, and Albert saw the legs properly for the first time. They were long, too long, gangly and disproportionate, like the animal hadn't grown into them yet. The paws were massive, with thick, dark claws that had left scratches on his workbench. When the animal moved, it didn't move like any dog Albert had ever known. The posture was lower, more cautious, weight distributed in a way that spoke of coiled readiness rather than domestic ease. Albert slowly withdrew his hand. The animal watched him with unblinking yellow eyes, not aggressive, not friendly, just watching with an intensity that felt predatory. When it finally shifted position, turning slightly on the workbench, Albert saw the distinctive pattern of the coat, the reddish tint more pronounced now that it was drying, the black-tipped tail that had been hidden under the blanket. His phone was still in his raincoat pocket, somehow miraculously dry in its waterproof case. Albert pulled it out with trembling hands, never taking his eyes off the creature. He typed with one thumb, Louisiana wild canine's reddish fur yellow eyes. The first image that came up made his breath catch. Red wolf, critically endangered, historically native to Louisiana wetlands, believed to be functionally extinct in the wild in this region. Albert's eyes darted between his phone screen and the animal on his workbench. The narrow snout, the long legs, the tawny-red coat, the yellow eyes, every detail matched. He scrolled frantically through more images, more articles, his heart hammering for entirely different reasons now. This wasn't a stray dog. This wasn't even a dog at all. This was a wild predator, a piece of Louisiana's vanishing wilderness, something that shouldn't exist anymore but somehow did. The animal, the wolf pup, he corrected himself, tilted its head slightly, still watching him with that unnerving intelligence. It was young, he realized now, maybe 4 or 5 months old. Still a baby, really, but a baby apex predator that had no business being in a residential storm drain during a flash flood. Albert's hand shook as he scrolled to the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries emergency line. This was beyond him. This was beyond anything he'd ever dealt with. The phone rang twice before a tired voice answered. LDWF Emergency Services. Albert's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. I think I just pulled a red wolf pup out of a storm drain.
Sir, red wolves are extinct in Louisiana. You probably have a coyote or...
It's not a coyote. Albert cut him off, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. I'm looking at it right now. Tawny red coat, yellow eyes, long legs, narrow snout. I'm looking at pictures on my phone and it's an exact match. This is a red wolf.
What's your location?
Albert gave his address, described the storm drain, explained the rescue in short, clipped sentences. The person on the other end, a woman named Sarah, kept him on the line, asking questions, her tone shifting from skeptical to urgent. She put him on hold twice, and Albert could hear muffled conversations in the background. The pup never moved, just lay there watching him with those ancient yellow eyes. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across his garage window. 2 trucks pulled into his driveway, and 4 people in LDWF jackets climbed out, carrying equipment cases and moving with the kind of controlled urgency that made Albert's story suddenly feel very real. Sarah was the first through the door, a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes went immediately to the workbench, and Albert watched her face transform, skepticism melting into shock, then something like awe.
Oh my God. That's actually a red wolf.
The other 3 crowded around, keeping a respectful distance from the pup, who had tensed at the intrusion but remained under the blanket. One of them, a younger man with a camera, was already taking photographs. Another, an older gentleman with silver hair and glasses, pulled out a tablet and began taking notes, his fingers flying across the screen.
How is this possible? We haven't had a confirmed red wolf sighting in this parish in over 30 years.
The silver-haired man looked up from his tablet. There's been some speculation about a remnant population in the Atchafalaya Basin, a few unconfirmed reports, some questionable tracks, but nothing concrete, nothing like this. He looked at Albert with something approaching reverence. Do you have any idea what you've done? This could change everything we thought we knew about red wolf recovery in Louisiana. Albert didn't know what to say to that. He just shook his head mutely, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own garage. These people knew what they were doing. These people understood the magnitude of what lay on his workbench. He was just a guy who'd heard something crying in a storm. Sarah pulled out a specialized carrier, lined with soft material, and worked with practiced efficiency to transfer the pup. The young wolf gave a low whine but didn't fight, either too exhausted or too smart to waste energy. Within minutes, they had the pup secured, had taken samples, fur, photos, measurements, and were preparing to transport. Where are you taking it? Albert found himself asking.
There's a wildlife rehabilitation center about 2 hours north. They specialize in endangered canids. They'll make sure the pup is healthy, check for injuries or illness, and then. If this pup came from a pack in the wild, if there really is a breeding population out there, this changes our entire conservation strategy. We'll try to track where it came from, see if we can locate others. And eventually, if everything goes well, we'll release this one back where it belongs.
The team packed up their equipment, loaded the carrier into one of the trucks, and Sarah handed Albert a card with her contact information. We'll need a full statement from you tomorrow, once the storm passes. And Mr. Albert, she offered him a tired smile. Thank you for not ignoring what you heard, for not assuming it was just another stray. A lot of people would have. Then they were gone, taillights disappearing into the rain, and Albert was alone in his garage again. He stood in the puddle of muddy water, surrounded by scattered blankets and the lingering smell of wet fur, and felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried Murphy. The rain was finally easing, the thunder growing distant. Albert walked out into his driveway and looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking up, revealing patches of stars between the gaps. The storm drains were still running high, but the worst had passed. Everything was washed clean, dripping, beginning again. He thought about the wolf pup in the back of that truck, heading towards safety and eventually back to the wild. He thought about how close he'd come to ignoring that howl, to letting his grief keep him locked inside while something irreplaceable drowned in the darkness. He thought about Murphy, who would have charged straight into that flood without a second thought. For the first time in 18 months, Albert smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sad one, but something real and warm and alive. Tomorrow he'd give his statement. Tomorrow he'd probably be sore as hell from the rescue. But tonight, standing in his driveway under the clearing sky, Albert felt something he'd thought was gone forever. He felt connected to this place, to the wild things that still fought to survive in the shrinking spaces between human development, to the part of himself that still knew how to care despite the risk of loss. The wolf pup had needed him, but maybe, in a way he was only beginning to understand, he'd needed the pup just as much. Albert turned back toward his house, the lights warm and welcoming through the windows. He had calls to make, people to talk to, a world he'd been hiding from for too long, and somehow, impossibly, he was ready. The wild had called out in the storm, and he'd answered. And in saving something rare and precious, he'd found a piece of himself he thought was lost forever.